Hello and welcome to today's lesson on atomic structure, which is found in the atomic structure topic of GCSE Combined Science, Physics. So in today's lesson, we're going to try to understand the subatomic structure of the atom. So if we've been successful and learned in today's lesson, we should be able to understand the different parts of the atom, state the properties of subatomic particles, and detail the composition of the atom from the periodic table. So in today's lesson, we're going to look at the following part of the AQA specification: 4.4.1.2 mass number, atomic number in isotopes. So physicists originally thought that the atom was the smallest possible component of the universe. Physicists thought that atoms were literally little balls which everything was made from, which we call the atomic model. But then physicists realised that atoms had an internal structure. We originally thought that this internal structure was that the atom was solid positive matter with sprinkles of negative charges. Now this is called the plum pudding model of the atom, which we'll look at in the next couple of lessons. Now, over the course of scientific history, there have been many different models of the atom. A scientific model is an idea used to explain observations and data. If data cannot be explained by a model, then we have to find a new model. So the idea was that when we came up with the plum pudding model, that this was decided upon because we observed electrons inside the atom, which meant that the ball model could not be true. So atoms do not exist like particles described early in the course in the particle model of matter topic. Now this meant we had to come up with a new model to explain the existence of the electron. So science is constantly changing its models to explain new evidence and data. Now we look at the development of the model of the atom in upcoming lessons. Now we all think of atoms like the following: the particle model of matter. Now when we actually looked at them under electron microscopes, it actually looked very similar to this. So here's an actual picture of nickel atoms, and we can reshape these atoms to make nice patterns and shapes. But our perception of the atom changed to our modern understanding when a scientist called Niels Bohr examined the atom. Now this showed us that atoms are not solid indivisible balls, they have a structure, which we call the subatomic structure. But what is found in the subatomic structure of the atom? Well, Democritus originally postulated that all atoms were indivisible balls, but by the end of the 19th century we realised this model was not correct. Bohr realised that atoms were not indivisible balls, but there was a structure inside of them, which we call the subatomic structure. Now the model was later experimentally confirmed by Ernest Rutherford in Manchester in 1911, in an experiment which was called Rutherford scattering experiment. Now it was determined that the atom had three smaller particles inside of it. The proton, a positively charged particle found in the nucleus with a relative mass of 1. The neutron, a neutral particle also found in the nucleus with a relative mass of 1. And the electron, a negatively charged particle which is found in energy levels around the nucleus but has a relative mass of 0, but it is fundamental, which means it can't be broken down further. So you've got the proton, the neutron and the electron. Now protons and neutrons are made from something smaller called quarks, which is covered in A-level physics. Now the proton and the neutron are of similar size, but the electron is much smaller than the proton and the neutron. So we consider all of the atomic mass to be in the nucleus. We assume the electrons have no effective mass. So we can summarise the properties of the subatomic particles as the following: the proton, a charge of +1 and a mass of 1. The neutron, a charge of 0 and a mass of 1. And the electron, a charge of -1 and a mass of 0. Now the number of protons in an atom determines the element. Each different element has a different number of protons. So if you change the number of protons, you change the type of element. The number of neutrons in an atom determines the isotope. Now each different isotope has a different number of neutrons. So if you change the number of neutrons without changing the number of protons, you change the type of isotope. And the number of electrons in an atom determines the ion. Each different ion has a different number of electrons. If you change the number of electrons without changing protons, you change the type of ion. So that's a very, very important idea to summarize. Now when the proton number is altered, this takes precedence over all other changes. This means that if there's ever a change in the proton number, it becomes a new element. A new isotope or ion can only occur if there's no change in proton number. So it was realized that protons and neutrons are found in the nucleus, which is very massive and dense, and the electrons are found in different energy levels around the nucleus. Now it's important to note the electrons do not orbit the nucleus, they exist in levels. Now different names for energy levels include states or orbitals or shells. Now the name for the shell nearest the nucleus is called the ground state, and the name for the shell furthest away from the nucleus is named the valence state. But most of the atom is empty space in between the nucleus and the energy levels. So to summarize the idea of the atom, we know this, that the proton and neutron exists in the nucleus in the middle of the atom, and the electrons exist in energy levels around the nucleus. The proton has a charge of 1 and a mass of 1. The neutron has a charge of 0 and a mass of 1, and the electron has a charge of -1 and a mass of 0. If you change the number of protons, it's a new element. If you change the number of neutrons without changing the number of protons, it's a new ion. If you change the number of neutrons without changing the number of protons, it's a new isotope. Now the periodic table is very useful in physics, as it can quickly tell a physicist how many each of a subatomic particle is in an atom. Now, when looking at elements in the periodic table, the information is displayed as the following. Now, the atomic mass or mass number is the number of protons and neutrons. It's always the bigger number around a symbol in the periodic table. The number at the bottom is the atomic number or the proton number, which is the number of protons in the atom, which is always the smaller number around the particle in the periodic table. Now, as every atom is neutrally charged, the number of electrons equals the number of protons for an atom. All atoms have to be electrically neutral, so the charges of the protons and the electrons cancels each other out. So in this atom, lithium, there's the following: 3 protons, because we know that from the bottom number, the proton number, the atomic number, which also means there's 3 electrons, because number of protons equals number of electrons, and the number of neutrons is 4, because it's the atomic mass number, okay, which is 7 minus the atomic number 3, so 7 minus 3 equals 4. So here's an example. What we've got here is there are 15 protons and neutrons in this nitrogen atom, there are 7 protons in this atom, and in the standard atom this implies that there's 7 electrons also in the atom. So this means the number of neutrons is 15 minus 7, which equals 8. Now the number of the protons is unique to every element in the universe. If the number changes, this indicates the atom becomes a different element. So if the 7 protons change to 6 protons, it will become a different element. It's gone from nitrogen into carbon. Now the idea of when an atom can change into a different element is called transmutation. Now this is why we believe we've discovered all the lighter elements in the universe, as the bottom number in the periodic table increases by 1 each element. So this means in the standard atom, the number of electrons in an atom increases by 1 per element. So what do we know? We know the idea that each energy level, except the first one around the nucleus, contains 8 electrons, and we also know that in a standard atom, the number of electrons in an atom increases by 1 per element. These facts combine to form the theory of periodicity, which explains all of chemistry. Now let's look at this particular idea here. So for example, with 3 isotopes of hydrogen, okay, we know that we have hydrogen, deuterium and tritium. Now we know that they must be different isotopes, as they have the same number of protons, 1, 1 and 1, but they have different number of neutrons, 0, 1 and 2. 1 minus 1 is 0, 2 minus 1 is 1, and 3 minus 1 is 2. So this led us to our modern understanding of the atomic structure and how subatomic particles are laid out in the atom. Now just to note, this is one atom. We have our nucleus as such in the center, like so. We then, when we have a look at our atom, we know that in the nucleus we have our number of our protons and our neutrons, and inside the nucleus the protons are positively charged, the neutrons don't have a charge, but each one of them has a relative mass of 1. So it's important to know we've got our positively charged protons and our neutral neutrons. Now in addition to this, we know that when we have our atom here, we've also got our electrons present in energy levels around the nucleus as such, like this. So each electron has a negative charge. They have very little mass, and their mass is 1/2000th of a proton or a neutron, but we don't consider their mass as it's so small compared to the proton and the neutron. And as we said before, the atomic mass is the larger number around the element in the periodic table. It's the number of protons and neutrons. The atomic number is a smaller number. It's the number of protons in the nucleus, as shown in this particular animation. Now it's important to know that if you change the number of protons, it's a different element. If you change the number of neutrons but not the number of protons, it's a different isotope. And if if you change the number of electrons, it's a different ion. Now, it's important to note that this particular model of the atom has a mistake, and that mistake is the scaling in these pictures is way off. There's a lot more empty space than shown here. If you actually drew the scale of this atom correctly, you wouldn't see the electrons or the nucleus in the picture. Now, every picture of an atom basically means the scale is not correct. The atom is actually 99.999999% empty space, which includes you are also 99.999999% empty space. So if we took all the empty space out of a human, you'd be smaller than a grain of sand, and the entire human race, all 7 billion plus of us, would fit inside of an apple. And if you took all the space out of the earth found in the earth would be the size of a tennis ball. So if the nucleus was the size of a fly, then the atom would actually be the size of a football stadium. So this gave us the Rutherford model of the atom, named after Rutherford, the scientist who completely worked it out and proved it experimentally. The atom is not a solid sphere, it's mostly empty space. The atom contains positive protons and neutral neutrons that make up most of the atomic mass. The protons and neutrons exist in the nucleus, and the atom also contains negative electrons to balance out the charge of the positive protons, but they exist around the outside of the nucleus in energy levels. Now, Rutherford proved this experimentally and Bohr proved this theoretically. Rutherford proved it experimentally with the Rutherford scattering experiment in 1911, and for this he won the Nobel Prize in chemistry, but not physics. Now, it's important to note that the physics community did not acknowledge this work, even though Rutherford was the director of physics at the University of Manchester. Now, there's one final problem with this particular model. Now, problems arise if you consider the electrons to orbit the atom and don't actually exist in energy levels. So this tells us that actually do not think the electrons orbit the atom like planets orbit the sun. It's not the case. Electrons exist in energy levels around the atom, which we'll look at in upcoming lessons. So what have we learned in today's lesson? The basic structure of an atom is a positively charged nucleus composed of both protons and neutrons surrounded by negatively charged electrons. The radius of a nucleus is less than 1/10,000th the radius of the atom. Most of the mass of the atom is concentrated in the nucleus. In an atom, the number of electrons is equal to the number of protons in the nucleus. Atoms have no overall electrical charge. All atoms of a particular element have the same number of protons. The number of protons in an atom of an element is called its atomic number. The total number of protons and neutrons in an atom is called its mass number, which you can represent on the periodic table. Now, atoms of the same element can have different number of neutrons, and these atoms are called isotopes. Atoms can turn into positive ions if they lose one or more of their outer electrons. So if we've been successful and learnt in today's lesson, we should be able to understand the different parts of the atom, state the properties of the subatomic particles, and detail the composition of the atom from the periodic table. I hope you've enjoyed today's lesson on the atomic structure of the atom, which is found in GCSE Combined Science Physics in the Atomic Structure module. Thank you very much for listening and have a lovely day.